Afternoon, everyone. I'm Bruce Caldwell, and I'd like to welcome you to another talk in our Hayek Lecture Series. This series of public lectures is sponsored by the Duke Center for the History of Political Economy, of which I am the director, the Duke Program in American Values and Institutions, and the Joint Duke-UNC Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, or PPE program. And it's made possible through a grant from the Thomas Smith Foundation. Our speaker today is Virginia Postrel. Ms. Postrel is a Los Angeles-based author, columnist, and speaker whose work spans a broad range of topics from social science to fashion, concentrating on the intersection of culture and commerce. Writing in Vanity Fair, Sam Tannenhouse described her as, I love this line, a master DJ who sequences the latest riffs from the hard sciences, the social sciences, business and technology, to name only a few sources. Ms. Postrel is the author of The Power of Glamour, Longing and the Art of Visual Persuasion, about which she will talk today, and we do have books available, which she'll be happy to sign just outside after the talk. Her previous books are The Substance of Style and The Future and Its Enemies. From 1989 to 2000, she served as the editor of Reason magazine, and she's currently a regular columnist for Bloomberg View. Please join me in welcoming Virginia Postrel.
Thanks, Bruce. So, oops. Okay. Have to do something about my voice first. Yeah. So, I'm here to talk today about glamour. And the first thing you have to know about glamour is it's probably not what you think it is, or at least it's more than you think it is. And one way to get at that is to start by thinking about what is glamorous. Don't think about the word glamour, think about glamorous. What is glamorous? And then start thinking about what is glamorous to whom? What is glamorous to you? What is glamorous to someone very different from you? Maybe very different. What's glamorous in one period is glamorous in another. And one of the things that you start to realize very quickly is that glamour is not a style. Glamour is not shiny furniture or satin dresses, because after all, some people like to go to the beach and other people like to go to the mountains. Glamorous vacation could be in a different place. There's a lot of variety. So when I started thinking about glamour, I started to try to think, what do all of these things have in common? And people often ask me about sort of what is your methodology? And what my methodology is, I start with the obvious things and try to figure out what they have in common. And then those things suggest other things. And then I start to see what they have in common and sort of tease it apart. So what I came to the conclusion was that glamour is a form of communication. Glamour is like humor. It's a form of communication that we recognize and identify by the emotional reaction that an audience has. So it's not a style. There is an audience and there's something or someone glamorous. And when those two things come together, the audience feels something in particular. In the same way that when there's an audience and there's something funny, you feel amusement, laughter. Well, in this case, you feel a pang of longing and projection. Projection and longing. If only life could be like that. If only I could be with them. If only I could go there. If only I could have that job. If only I could drive that car. If only, the world could be different or my life could be different. Glamour takes us out of the everyday and makes us feel, if only for a moment, sort of a sense of our longings and ideals being fulfilled. And as a result, it's a very powerful form of what I call nonverbal persuasion. It's a form of rhetoric. And like any form of persuasion and rhetoric, it can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. It can work on some audiences and not on other audiences. So this is not a brief about glamour is good or glamour is evil. I've noticed that people who read my book not carefully tend to fall about 50-50 into she's all saying how glamour is so bad or she's all saying how glamour is wonderful. No, it's like any form of persuasion. it can be used for many different purposes, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But what it does is it makes us feel what these little kids in these pictures are feeling. These are both pictures from my book. Makes us feel sort of if only. And as you can see from the objects here, she has a movie star magazine, and then this is very common when those of us who grew up in the 50s or 60s, in my case, this was a very common form of glamour in those days, the idea of going into space and sort of the rocket. Imagining ourselves in different, better circumstances. And of course, glamour is often used to sell things, literally sell things in the marketplace. It's not the only use of it, and we'll talk about some other ones, but it literally sells things in the marketplace, and it sort of sells things by saying what the beautiful dress card suggests. Buy me, lady, said the dress, and I will make you into a beautiful and whole and complete human being. Do not be silly, said the man, for a dress alone cannot do that. True, said the lady, I will have the shoes and the bag as well. But lest you men think that you are immune to this, think of all the Air Jordans that have been sold with the promise that you will be like Mike. Oh, that was a different commercial, but still. Ever have that dream where you can fly? I mean, we often invest commercial goods in with things that we know perfectly well they cannot fulfill. And another phrase that I use about glamour, which I actually took from an economic sociologist writing more generally, is it is an illusion known to be false but felt to be true. It's like a magic trick. The audience is suspending its disbelief. The audience knows that is not the true facts of the world in all their details, but it says something true about our desires, about what we want and the life we would like to have. And another way of thinking of it is this very funny book, by the way. I should only recommend my own book, but if you want a good laugh, and especially if you're into watching HGTV or looking at house ads, Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House by another LA writer named Megan Daum. Glamour is very common in the world of real estate and interiors. More common, I would argue, even than in like the movies these days. It's like, look at this perfectly staged house. Imagine yourself in that kitchen. Think about how many spa tubs have been sold and never used because people pictured themselves relaxing in that tub. So glamour holds out the promise of a different, better life. And it can be very powerful and very influential and very positive. So this is a woman named, a very young woman named Michaela DePrince, who is a professional dancer. But she was not born Michaela DePrince, and she was certainly not born a professional dancer. She was born in Sierra Leone, and when she was 4 years old, she was living in the most horrible of circumstances. She was living in an orphanage in a refugee camp. Her father had been killed in the Civil War, murdered. Her mother had died of starvation. And if that isn't, horrible and heartrending enough, of all the kids in the camp, in the orphanage, they would literally rank them by numbers, and she had the worst number. They called her a devil child because instead of having, perfectly even brown skin like the other children, she had these white marks on her skin, and she also was a little rebellious in her personality. So they had, between the imperfect skin and the rebellious personality, no one is going to want to adopt her. We don't like her. Everybody treated her terribly badly. So she's living in these horrible, horrible circumstances. Little bitty girl. One day, a dance magazine from who knows where, a Western dance magazine, blew up against the fence. And on the cover of the magazine was this beautiful ballerina smiling, sparkles and glitter and something about, I don't know, I always assumed that was cultural, but maybe all 4-year-old girls are genetically programmed to like sparkles and glitter. But anyway, she saw this picture and it just transported her out of those horrible circumstances. And she thought, that is what I want to be. She tore it off, and she had no backpack, much less a chest of drawers. She had no personal space. So she put it in her underwear because that was the only sort of personal storage space she had. And every night she would take it when they would go to sleep, she'd take it out and look at it and dream. And it sort of, she said, that saved me. So what happened was, not too long after this, she had found the dance magazine, a couple from New Jersey came to the orphanage to adopt a different little girl who was her friend. And one thing led to another, and they ended up adopting both of them. So she pulled out the picture, showed her new adult and her new mother, and so when she went to New Jersey, she started taking dance, and she was totally driven. I mean, she was dancing on point very early on. She was totally, because she wanted to be like the picture. And that is the power of glamour. Now, obviously, that is a power of glamour that has a happy ending. Not every little girl who dreamed like that would get what she wanted. Anne Frank put pictures of movie stars up in the secret annex, and her life didn't end so well. But even with a sad ending, it does take you out of difficult circumstances. So that's a positive story of glamour. Another very important and powerful thing that glamour does is that it often will focus people's idea on a potential career. So I'm of a certain age where a lot of other journalists that I know were inspired by Woodward and Bernstein. Not the literal Woodward and Bernstein who worked for the Washington Post necessarily, but the ones played by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman in the movie. The idea of being a reporter and being this crusader and truth, justice, and the American way. And maybe they became, police beat reporters or commercial real estate reporters, but they were inspired by that. Similarly, forensic science programs talk about a CSI effect, where suddenly they had all these new students in their who watched these CSI shows. In the 1990s, LA law inspired a lot of people to go to law school. So one of the and I talk in the book also, I won't tell the story, you have to read the book, about Oprah Winfrey and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which wasn't supposed to be glamorous, but to her watching it, it was, and it shaped her life. Now, obviously, if you actually pursue one of these things, you learn all the things that are hidden. You learn the tedious, boring parts that get left out of the movies. But it can be very inspiring. Another form, in 2008, 2009, I used to say Barack Obama was God's gift to my glamour project, because I was working on the book then. And, it's people have trouble agreeing on like what movie stars are glamorous, or maybe they're not as glamorous as they used to be. But Barack Obama in 2008 was very unusual because he was an actually glamorous politician. It's unusual because people projected onto him all their hopes and dreams and what they wanted in a president, what they wanted in a country, what they wanted in a world. He was a little mysterious, not so mysterious that you couldn't identify with him, but a little unusual. He didn't have a long public record. I mean, compared to Hillary Clinton, his opponent, he was the more exotic, more interesting person. And again, people projected onto him. One of his friends during the early in the race told Rolling Stone he's a Rorschach test. People see in him what they want to see. Now, that is great when you're running for something. It makes it difficult to govern because all of these different hopes and dreams are not necessarily the same hopes and dreams. And when you get to actually be president or governor or whatever, you have to make decisions, or even if you don't decide, not deciding is a decision. And some people are going to be happy. And I'm talking about of your supporters. Some people are going to be happy and some people are going to be disillusioned. So glamour can be a dicey thing, but there's no question that that was a huge factor in his election. So what I do in the book is, one of the things I do is I analyze the three elements that are present in all forms of glamour. And the first of those elements is the promise of escape and transformation. So glamour takes many different kinds of longings. Longings for respect, longings for love, longings for fame, wealth, comfort, courage, camaraderie, friendship, whatever. And it turns those longings into some version of escape or transformation. The idea of a different, better self in different, better circumstances. And that is the reason that we have such an association between glamour and travel and glamour and fashion. Both of those are things that have inherent in them a promise of escape and transformation. Go to this beach and you will feel differently. Wear this dress and you will feel differently. We look at a picture like this of of a plane ascending up into a full moon. And even though if we think about it, we know that it's very unpleasant to be on a plane these days. When we look at that picture, we actually identify maybe more with the plane itself rather than with the passengers on it. And we have that pang of projection and longing of going to some exciting and unknown place full of possibilities. Similarly, lots of transportation vehicles are glamorous, cars and trains. And I used to think every transportation vehicle except for buses had been glamorous. And then I found a glamorous picture of a streamlined Greyhound bus. So I guess even in certain circumstances, buses might work. Glamour, again, is often famously used in advertising and marketing. Again, proffering that buy our product, have that escape and transformation. This is a very famous, this one is a very famous campaign in the 50s called Fire and Ice for this red nail polish from Revlon. And this is a remake of it more recently. And what Fire and Ice was saying is basically, you may be a housewife, spend your day wrangling kids and scrubbing floors, but with this nail polish, you will be transformed into this sexy vixen. And and it was very successful. I mean, it doesn't say that explicitly. And this is what I mean by nonverbal persuasion. Even when word pictures are being drawn, it's really more about an image into which you can project yourself. So this is the most glamorous store in America. People think that the most glamorous store in America because they confuse luxury and glamour. They think that the most glamorous store in America must be Tiffany's or Bergdorf's or someplace like that. No, it is the Container Store. Because what do Americans, at least of the market, what do they want? They want control over their stuff. You walk those aisles and you just think, if I had these boxes, my life would be perfect. I could get all my stuff under control. And of course, the store is so beautifully ordered. And, you don't see the people who are working after hours to keep it all straightened up. You don't see that stuff. No, this is the promise that, you can have this sort of orderly life. All you need is the right boxes. So that's a form of glamour. And there is this, even in the nature of the containers, there's a kind of mystery. So the second characteristic, or the first characteristic element that's in all forms of glamour is the promise of escape and transformation. The second is grace. Glamour is the art that conceals art, or is one of the arts that conceals art. We often see the word effortless in association with glamour, sometimes literally, as in this ad, effortless glamour, but other times it'll just be some person who's glamorous is discussed as being effortless. This effortlessness represents what Castiglione, giving advice in the 16th century, called sprezzatura, which is this nonchalance, hiding all the difficulties. So glamour is an illusion, I mentioned earlier. The word literally, originally meant a literal magic spell. You cast a glamour on someone and they saw something that wasn't there. And as the word evolved in the 19th century to take on this metaphorical use that the way we use it today, it still maintained that idea of an illusion, that idea of magic. And we often talk about magic in conjunction with glamour. Well, what is the illusion? The illusion is the grace. The illusion is not the promise of escape and transformation. That may be illusory, but it can also be true. I mean, Michaela de Prince really did become a ballerina. The illusion is that the world is full of distractions and difficulties and costs and all of those things that get hidden in the glamorous vision where there's this perfect grace and things are effortless. So one of the things I do in the book is I provide a lot of what I call intellectual infrastructure. So part of that is there are three central elements to glamour. There's a lot of there are three of these, there are four of those. This is like this, glamour is like this other thing is like that. Well, one of the things I talk about is two forms of grace. One is what I call theatrical grace, which is that in the actual moment, there is real grace. So when Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dance, they are literally graceful. But the vision in the movie is they just meet each other in the park and suddenly start dancing. It's all, spontaneous and effortlessly perfect. Well, in real life, of course, they were rehearsing in bloody shoes and millions of takes and retakes and practice. That's what's hidden. Similarly, in theatrical grace, things are hidden off stage. So this is in the 1930s. This is Jean Harlow from Dinner at 8. I forget what year it is, but in the early 30s. These glamorous gowns that we associate with that period, they would literally be sewn into them. This was in the days before Lycra. So in order to have that perfectly smooth line, you had to make the dress so tight that the actress couldn't sit down. So between takes, they would lean on these, what they call leaning boards. And in other cases, primarily period dramas, the dresses would be so heavy, similarly, that they would lean on. So this is theatrical grace, where the difficulties and distractions are hidden sort of off stage, and there is an actual sense of grace in the moment. The second kind of grace is what I call darkroom grace, and this is probably what we think of more when we think of a word like glamorization, or when we think of creating glamorous images, which is actually taking the real thing and obscuring, working to obscure what is there on the image and creating a glamorous still image. So, for example, if you go through, say, a Crate and Barrel catalog, you will not see things like this. You'll not see all these cords that you might trip over. All the lamps seem to operate on batteries. Everything is just magically, working on electricity without cords. And sometimes they even get so carried away that they not only get rid of the cord, they get rid of the other leg. This is what we think of. We think about retouching, overly retouching, and this is an ad for those sheets and the bedding. And people often think, especially very young people, that this retouching started with Photoshop when it became easy to do online. But in fact, retouching is very old. Before there was photography, people would just draw things so that everybody looked, the women looked all elongated and perfect, and everybody's skin was ideal and that sort of thing. But once photography came around, people used to retouch the negatives. So these are photos. I don't know how well you can see them in here, but these are photos by George Harrell, who was the sort of golden age Hollywood photographer in the 30s and 40s and created a lot of the imagery of Hollywood glamour. These are photographs of Joan Crawford, who was a big star in those days, and before and after. So in the before, she's covered with freckles. She has lines here, as most people do. She's got a little bit of a dent here. All of that has vanished. It's all perfectly ideal. And the other thing he used to do is less obvious on this photo than on some of his others, is in lieu of mascara, he would just draw really long eyelashes right on the negative. And so the people would come out with these amazingly long eyelashes. And so that's darkroom grace. And darkroom grace can happen even with a candid image, because a still image is selective. So this is probably the most famous paparazzo photo ever. It's called Windblown Jackie Onassis, walking down the street in New York. Very candid. She's caught by surprise. But here's what it looked like before cropping. So it's still a very candid photo, but distractions have been eliminated. And so it's not only negative things, but it's things that would take your mind off the projecting and the ideal. So that's darkroom grace. So the third element of glamour, we've got the promise of escape and transformation, grace. The third element is mystery. Glamour always includes mystery. It's a word that, whenever somebody's saying whether somebody is glamorous or not, or a place is glamorous or not, the first thing you say, well, is there mystery? That always has to leave something to the imagination for two reasons. First is mystery is intriguing. It draws you in. You want to know more. It pulls you in. It enhances projection. And the second, of course, is that if something is a little mysterious, it's a little distance, you can hide things. I like to say that glamour is neither transparent nor opaque. It's translucent. It gives us just enough information that we can project ourselves, see ourselves in the other, project ourselves into that ideal without getting so bogged down in the specifics and details that it destroys the mood. Glamorous imagery often uses certain tropes to preserve mystery. Obviously, literally translucent glass, sunglasses. You see things from the back. You see windows rather, where you can partially see but not entirely see. This is a famous photo of Los Angeles and this modern house, case study house number 22 by Pierre Koenig, taken by Julius Schulman. And this is an intensely glamorous photograph because of the way it uses mystery and distance. We see the two young women in the living room having a conversation. We don't know what they're talking about. We don't know who they are. It draws us in. We would like to join that conversation. At the same time, we see the city arrayed before them with the lights. And each of those lights is sort of a possible life, a place you could be. And between the two, it has this sort of double mystery to it. It's very intriguing, very glamorous, very idealized, and yet specific enough that we can see ourselves in it. This mystery is often created through distance. So, things that are far away, places that are far away are often used to create glamour. So this is Shanghai perfume in the early 20th century. I have a sidebar in the book about Shanghai and its different forms of glamour. It's early 20th century glamour for the West, it's early 20th century glamour within China, and then what it represents today, all of them different versions of glamour. Ralph Lauren said, I never went to Africa. If I had gone to Africa, I probably wouldn't have designed the clothes I did. It represented a mood. He had an idea of Africa in his head that created his safari collections that had very little to do with the actual Africa. It was sort of a glamorous ideal displaced in space and implicitly also a little bit in time, because even though people do go on safaris, it's not really what this represents. We often find glamour in the past, so we have dramas like Mad Men, or in the future. And I have a discussion in the book about the glamour of Star Trek. And I use it primarily as an example of how something that is not obviously glamorous in the way that a fashion magazine would recognize can be glamorous to its audience. And I did a big survey of Star Trek fans, and one of the things that I found was that in addition to sort of projecting themselves into an adventurous life or into exploration, one of the things that people found very glamorous about the show was its portrayal of an ideal workplace that they could see themselves in as themselves, contributing to a team, that sort of camaraderie, but it's meritocratic. There's not office politics in the Star Trek workplace. There's not deadbeats. There's not abusive bosses. Those things don't really exist, or if they do, they're just plot points that are gone by the end of the show. It's sort of this ideal environment, ideal setting, and often the case with TV shows or with movies, what's glamorous is it's not the plot, because the plot is too complicated for glamour. It's the setting, or it's the mood, or it's a particular scene. Another place where mystery becomes important, and I discuss this in the mystery chapter, is the distinction between glamour and charisma. And one of the things that I do with this intellectual infrastructure is I distinguish between glamour and other things that are similar to but different from glamour. So charisma is often confused with glamour. But the fundamental difference is that charisma is a quality of a person. It's like intelligence. It is something that a charismatic person has, and people feel it whether they like that person or they don't like it. Although it does tend to make you want to like the person, make you want to be liked by the person. Whereas glamour is in the audience's head. They see that person and they perceive them as glamorous because whoever it is has the 3 elements, but they also represent something important to that audience. So I have a chart, which you can see here, of different people who are glamorous versus charismatic. Here are some of the characteristics that are different. The main one, as I say, is the audience defines the meaning for glamour, whereas the charismatic person defines the meaning for with charisma. They are enlisting you in their charismatic cause. And typically, any successful politician is going to have at least a modicum of charisma. Similarly, any successful actor or coach or teacher or preacher, I mean, there's certain things where you're trying to enlist people and get them to sort of support you. You need charisma for it. Glamour is something where people are projecting their own meanings onto you. So it's very successful. It can be a very successful sales tool. As I say here, it's good for campaigning, but it makes it harder to govern because charisma is more of a quality of leadership that makes people want to enlist with you as opposed to with sales where you're just convincing them that whatever it is fulfills their longings. And one of the characteristics that distinguishes it, somebody dead can be glamorous. And in fact, it often helps to die, especially young, because then there's all that possibility. Just think what it could have been. We just went through the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. You're forever young. There's all that mystery of what could have been. Charisma, on the other hand, when the charismatic person is gone, that charisma is gone. I mean, the best thing would be maybe a video recording. But we don't know why Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, was so, why did he get to be the guy who represented Jacksonian democracy? We don't know. We don't really understand Theodore Roosevelt. We understand his views, we understand what he did, but we don't understand the magnetic effect he had on people. And so that is charisma. It's something that you own, and when you're gone, it's gone. Whereas glamour, because it's fundamentally owned by the audience, can disappear, it can be reborn, it's about what's in their head. So to sum up the sort of how to construct glamour, I mentioned George Harrell before, these are a couple of his images. He said, bring out the best, conceal the worst, and leave something to the imagination. And that's what glamour does. And as a result, it can be highly inspiring, highly motivating. It can be very positive. It can be very negative, depending on what it motivates you to do. And what's important to remember about it is that it is a useful guide. It can tell us true things about what we want, what we desire, what our longings are, often our unarticulated, unspoken longings. And it may even tell us how to achieve them, but it can only be a guide, not a destination, because in the real world, all of those things that are hidden in glamour's grace come back to be visible, and you have to take them under consideration. Thank you.
Would you mind taking some questions?
Quite happy to.
I'd like to start actually with your
Prerogative.
I'll use my prerogative. So I was trying to imagine, I want to be glamorous, but I'm also very cheap. So I'm trying to imagine, how do you achieve glamour that isn't affiliated with wealth? Now, some of the examples that you gave were of jobs, and I could see that would be, that would be one category. And then I came up with Madonna, but I didn't know if that worked. Kind of try to go for kind of the.
Right. So first of all, you're not going to be glamorous to yourself. Okay, because you're never glamorous to yourself because you know yourself. You know all the flaws. There is no mystery. You're probably not going to be glamorous to your spouse unless you have an unusual marriage. It does happen, but usually. It's like that man, no man is a hero to his valet. Well, the same is it's true about glamour. People know you. So that if you are going to be glamorous, you, Bruce, it's probably through, the ideal of, wouldn't it be great to run this center and, think deep thoughts and, and actually that's the kind of glamour that works really well on me. It's like, so to me, Bruce is glamorous. I have all this intellectual glamour. It works really well on me. The contemplative life. I'm actually terrible at the contemplative life because I can't sit in a chair long enough and hold still. But I want it. So I keep doing things like writing this book that sort of forced me to do it. But so the things that are glamorous are, we think about things associated with wealth and luxury because one of the things that a lot of people want is material comfort or material well-being, and also because there are other things associated with wealth and luxury that are other desires people have, to be admired. I mean, you don't always admire rich people, but it is one thing to attract the opposite sex, have sex appeal. That's especially for men. That's often something that comes along with wealth, just to be comfortable. To be successful in your profession, which may lead to wealth, but what you're really desiring is that kind of achievement. So it's easy to associate glamour with wealth, but there certainly are other forms of glamour that are not dependent on wealth. If you talk about a person being glamorous, it probably has something to do with what their professional activities are, or it has to do with what image they present to the public. So, one possible image is I am a rich rock star, but another possible image might be, I am the perfect mother. It might be totally false. Now that one's not open to you, but it might be totally false, but the person could seem to be very glamorous to other mothers who seem like, well, how come her kids are always like perfectly dressed and well behaved and mine are running around like crazy people over here? So that there are all kinds of things like that. And also, depending on the audience, quirky things can be glamorous. So I mentioned Oprah Winfrey. I'll go ahead and tell the story. The Mary Tyler Moore Show was glamorous. Now, the Mary Tyler Moore Show was a sitcom that was based on embarrassing situations. It was not intended to be glamorous, but she just stripped away the specifics of the plot and saw this kind of great workplace with people who are she was living in great poverty and abuse and, a very difficult circumstances. There's all these people, they're having an interesting life, they have great colleagues. Mary is pretty and she's well dressed, and she identified with that and went into TV news. Now, she was actually not very good at TV news, but fortunately somebody had the bright idea to give her a talk show, and that worked out for her. Another example that I tell in this very short example was when he was in the 6th grade, Jay-Z went to his 6th grade teacher's house. So she's trying to broaden. First of all, she was took him under her wing, and she sort of saw his talent and his smarts. But he was inspired by her ice maker on her refrigerator. And he just thought, I want one of those someday. And the funny thing is, we laugh because by the time Jay-Z was in the 6th grade, ice makers on refrigerators were very common in middle-class homes. But that type of push-button kind of automated thing, if you'd gone back to the 1950s, that would have been a glamorous thing for the middle class. That sort of push-button, instant, on-demand control was huge in mid-century. It's all over the advertising and that sort of ease. So, I don't know, that's a long way to say, Bruce, go with what you know. try to publicize the glamour of the Hayek Center or whatever. So it's not called the Hayek Center, but you never know what someone might find glamorous. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, it seems like what you're presenting is stuff that you've figured out. You've just examined and analyzed. But I wondered also did you start with sources? Are you building upon the work of previous scholarship?
Right. I build on scholarship, but not scholarship about glamour. Because there's very little scholarship specifically about glamour, and it's not very good. Because what it tends to do is turn into scholarship about celebrity. So the scholarship that I build on, particularly in the second chapter, there's actually a Venn diagram showing how these two scholarly ideas intersect and create glamour, is out of anthropology and economic sociology and things where they're not writing specifically about glamour, but writing about sort of, I guess you could say projection in terms of commercial goods. And then I also build a lot of historical scholarship about, the experience. There are a couple of chapters about history, but the experience of what it was like in when large commercial cities developed. And one of the things I find is, you read scholars who are writing about Edo, Japan, and you read scholars that are writing about Paris, and you find similar patterns of institutions, even developing once you have these sort of large commercial cities. You find a certain role for the demi-monde, you find a certain role for the theater, a certain kind of proliferation of glamour that is very different. The cultural contexts are very different, and there's not cross-fertilization necessarily. But there's something about that situation that creates a certain situation. So this is mostly original of me doing pattern finding and drawing on certain for narrower questions, drawing on scholarship. But no, there's yes.
It seems like a lot of the images you presented here and other things I can think of. Art Deco is kind of consistently glamorous. Like it had a moment in the 50s where people referred back to it, and again in the 80s, and again now it's
Right.
Kind of a shining moment. And so I'm wondering, I imagine there are lots of other kind of design moments like that are referenced back in glamorous images of current times. But is it something inherent in the design, or is it something about the 20s that we're thinking about
Right.
as being the reference?
Well, I think there's a couple of complicated things going on. First of all, in the original period, which is basically the 30s, and we're talking primarily about American Art Deco, which is that streamlined look, as opposed to French Art Deco, which is more luxurious materials, which is also glamorous in a different way. But in the 30s, and I talk a lot about this, not just Art Deco, in the 30s, there was an intense glamour around ideas of modernity and speed and the future. And those were embodied in lots of Art Deco artifacts. And people were actually sort of using glamour to figure out what all of these things meant. And by using, I mean in a sort of emergent, there are lots of people writing manifestos, theoretical manifestos about what it meant to be modern, but sort of the average person on the street is kind of piecing together this Joan Crawford movie and this streamlined car they saw an ad for and this and that, and figuring out, what is modernity. So that's the meaning that those things took on in the 30s. Now, I would disagree with you about Art Deco being glamorous in the 50s. Art Deco was not glamorous in the 50s. Art Deco was actually out of style in the 50s. The things that were popular were, there were two things. One is to high art critics or high design critics, Art Deco was considered too decorative. And to the sort of vast majorities, it's the period of things looking like rocket ships and the tail fins and not that streamlined, smooth look. So now I think starting in the 80s and up till today, I think there are a couple of things going on with Art Deco. One is that we associate it now with a period of great optimism about the future. Also the same, and funnily enough, the tail fins have the same, and all that Populux 1950s mid-century modernism has the same thing. So that we are sort of nostalgic for a future that never happened, or actually it did happen, but then it was the present and it wasn't glamorous anymore. So we're sort of almost like recreating a sense of glamour around it. And then the other thing is, I think it's just beautiful. I mean, it's not just about glamour. It's actually about what is aesthetically pleasing about it, in the same way that classical statues are. It sort of hit an aesthetically pleasing sweet spot. And so a lot of the appeal is not so much about meanings as just about the pure sensual pleasure of it. But it does have that streamlining. It's very graceful. There's always a sense of mystery through the stylization. And a lot of it is about speed and taking you to, some better place. Yeah.
I love what you said, about glamour being an illusion and magic trick. And I'm curious, in today's society, through technology and media, it seems to be in a time of increased transparency. There's less illusion.
Right.
So you can say there's a lot of personal oversharing.
Yeah, right.
That is either blogging or being on social media talking about every little thing of your day, or knowing the personal details about public figures' private lives.
Right.
Or seeing someone wearing a gorgeous dress and having them reveal to you, oh, it's actually from TJ Maxx. Whether it's in a bunch of different ways.
Right.
We're sort of in that time.
Right.
And I'm curious how that and this idea of glamour,
Right.
relates in today's
Yeah,
world.
right. It's a really good question. And one of the points that I make in the very first chapter is that it's sort of people are always talking about glamour disappearing and reappearing, and it was really amazing that it exists at all, because there's so many things, so many values that we hold that go against it. I mean, we value practicality, we value honesty, transparency, frankness, casualness. The natural as opposed to the artificial, even overt sexuality, that kind of thing, oversharing, confessional culture, all of those things sort of cut against glamour, and yet it's constantly being reborn in new forms that are less, that have been less explored and less familiar, because it caters to some kind of desire on people's part, as well as there are commercial and not just commercial. There are other reasons to try to gin up persuasive means, and not only for commercial purposes, but for anything where you're trying to persuade people. So that's part of it. But the other thing is, first of all, not everybody does overshare. There's a tendency to emphasize it because it happens with many people, and to suggest that, for example, we know everything about every celebrity. We don't even know anything about Angelina Jolie. I mean, who is like in the tabloid. I mean, she is like not exactly secretive, but we know very little about her. I mean, what are Angelina Jolie's politics? Well, like, she wants to help poor people in the third world, but that's not very specific. She does good deeds. She's against landmines. But how about do you know who she voted for? I mean, you may have assumptions, but you don't know that for sure. There are lots of things you don't know about her. You don't, even though the tabloids are, of course, constantly trying to find this out, which was true in Golden Age Hollywood as well. So that's one thing. There's an exaggeration of the amount of sharing. Number two is, and this is totally not in the book, this is something someone said in a Q&A, which I thought was really interesting. It was not my insight. Actually, a lot of what's happening with social media is people creating glamorous versions of their own lives. I mean, it's like when you hear it, it's obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it. It's like, here is, and of course, people use filters on their photos so they all look really good, and so and they also present themselves as sort of their best self, the most interesting self. I mean, it's not the only way people present themselves, but that is one possibility. And then another thing which I do talk in the book, in the mystery chapter, I talk about different forms of mystery, and this is a case where I take this sort of aesthetic tropes that are associated with glamour, and then turn them into metaphors, so that you have the sort of shadow and streamlining, and that kind of mystery is where you actually literally hide the thing. Then there is the sort of sparkly kind of thing. You know, why do we associate sparkle with glamour, or androgyny with glamour? These are things where it's confusing. There's an ambiguity. It makes you look twice, and the mystery is created through a different technique. And then the third one is complexity, where things are too complicated to fully take in. So, you know, Frank Gehry's buildings as opposed to the Chrysler buildings. The Chrysler building would be sort of the streamlined glamour, mystery of shadow, whereas Frank Gehry's building is that complexity. And these are aesthetic tropes, but they're also metaphors for ways of creating mystery. And one of the ways that you can create mystery, even if people know a lot about you, or a place that used to be exotic has become a tourist attraction, is if you or it is complicated enough so that there's always more to discover. And so people don't really know what the truth is, because there are multiple truths. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Well, it seems to me that you've mostly focused talk on what glamour means to us, so on the demand side. Given that this is an Hayek lecture, I was wondering, to what extent is glamour designed from the other side, from the advertising company, all these people? To what extent are they aware
Right.
of the necessity to hide certain parts of the
Right,
process?
right. So the analogy that I use, sort of the fundamental analogy that I use to understand glamour, is the analogy to humor. That glamour is this kind of communication the way humor is a communication. All right, so think about humor and this question. Sometimes you're sitting around with your friends and somebody says something funny. It's completely spontaneous and, you know, unplanned. Other times, you know, there's a whole industry of people in Hollywood and in Madison Avenue who are trying to write jokes or write sitcoms or write funny ads. And they're trying to create humor in the same way that there are people who try to create glamour. But then, so it's designed, and this is designed in that sense, but it's in the marketplace. It's within, this is the high thing, there's a market test. Whether it's a commercial product or it's whether or not it's a commercial product, there's a market test, and the market test is, does the audience laugh? Does the audience feel that feeling of glamour? So in that sense, it's, you know, that's how I would say it. You can try to design it. And, you know, if I give a lecture to a branding conference of ad agency people, you know, I talk about these three elements, and I talk about how, you know, you have to think about your product or your brand and think about, well, is this something where it's appropriate? You know, what are the underlying desires of your audience? Is this something that you can, you know, appropriately come up with a sense of escape and transformation? Is that something realistically associated with whatever it is you're selling? How do you, you know, what do you need to hide? How do you preserve mystery? Those kinds of things can be, you know, if you're trying to construct glamour, that's like it's not a how-to, but those are the questions you have to ask. So it's, you know, it's designed in the same way, you know, that this bottle is designed, but whether somebody accepts it depends on you know, whether it serves the purposes of the audience. Yeah.
There seem to be, this might connect up with Richard's question, there seem to be certain commonalities between your conception of glamour as a certain type of verbal or nonverbal persuasion with, are you familiar with Harry Frankfurt's conception of verbal bullshit at all?
Oh, is this the book?
Yeah.
Bullshit? I haven't read that book. No, I mean I know it exists, but yeah, right, because of the title mostly.
Last 100 years.
Yeah, right.
But, there seem to be certain. I mean, you might want to.
Yeah, I should.
He thinks of bullshit as being basically a purposely deceptive form of verbal persuasion.
Right.
So the speaker is purposely trying to deceive
Right,
the audience.
right.
And there seems to be a lot in
Yeah.
common here with your
Well, I
concept
think
of
that would be a, you know, I think that there is something very true in glamour, that it only works if it's telling you, revealing something true about who you are and what you want, which is not to say it doesn't contain this element of illusion, because it does. But I think it would be wrong to reduce it to bullshit, you know, either in the technical sense or the more generic sense, more colloquial sense. And it would also be wrong to think that you can escape it in the way that I think through sort of an, it's like theoretically possible not to have bullshit, I think. Whereas people will create glamour for themselves, even if nobody is trying to do it for them. They will just, see things that inspire them, where it's a sort of act of imagination and desire that the audience will do even if no one is trying to do it. Obviously, if people are trying to engage in persuasion of whatever kind, you will have more use of the tools of persuasion, whatever they are. But this is something that people also create for themselves. Yeah.
Wondering, while you were showing your slides, I thought of the Killing It Softly series. And I don't know if you've seen those movies or not. The three.
Yeah, I'm aware of them, but I haven't seen them, no. Sorry. Now I've got a lot of homework.
Well, they're actually about advertising, about images of women in advertising.
Okay. I may have seen some, all right.
Negative,
Yeah, right.
women are skinny. And,
Oh, right, yes, okay, yeah.
there's actually now a rebellion against that. So I was thinking, how that might relate to what you're talking about, and how do such negative images and such impossible
Right.
images
Well,
actually get to be allegedly glamorous?
Well, first of all, there's this myth that this started with advertising and photography. And of course, first of all, I have pictures of the Gibson girl in my book, and she's drawn, when people were drawing with pen and ink, the images were much less realistic than they are today, because at least somebody sort of has to exist. And similarly with Renaissance paintings or whatever. But yeah, I think that the best take on this is actually in a review of my book on the New Inquiry by a woman who writes a lot about images of beauty, and is very concerned with those kinds of questions. And this is an example of how, like, you put something in a book for one reason and it turns out to be meaningful for a completely different reason. So it turns out that the Star Trek thing is her way into understanding this, because her little brother, when they were kids, was really, really into Star Trek. And what she realized in sort of making this analogy and seeing the analogy in the book was that these kinds of images only work if you see yourself in them in some way. You have to have some kind of identification. It can't be entirely negative. And I'm not really doing justice to her argument, but it is my argument, but it's sort of the way she presented it was very, very, very good. That first of all, there are lots of different possible images of women, of what it means to be a beautiful woman, and people tend to project themselves only into some of them. Otherwise, they'll dismiss them, or they'll say, that's ridiculous, and I'm, not. You may think that's glamorous, but that woman looks like she just came out of a concentration camp. I don't find that glamorous at all, and that sort of thing. So that I don't think that people will. Merely the fact that you put an image in front of a person does not make them want to be like that. There is a more subtle argument, which doesn't have to do with glamour, is that exposure to lots of images creates a sense of what's normal. And that's even if it's not normal. So whether that's, what sort of body types are likely, are normal, or what sort of houses are normal, or what sort of behavior on college campuses is normal. If you see a lot of images that are very selective, it can warp your perception of what is really going on in the real world, or what's possible. But that's different from glamour, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be like that. It's just that you perceive that all college students are getting completely bombed out drunk every weekend, even though it turns out that when they do studies, it's a very small percentage of the population, a relatively small percentage of the population. And this is a similar kind of thing, that people have this image of a normal body that's not necessarily typical. Yeah.
I don't know if you necessarily go into this in the book, but what do you think about kind of the motivation behind like the paparazzi industry, and just the fact that a lot of the people that go and search for that, you know, what are the people that I admire so much doing on a daily basis, and kind of like trying to bring them down to that level of real people, you know, how does that play into that
Right.
dynamic of admiration, but also,
Right,
you know,
right. Yeah, this is a really good question, really interesting, because there is this, if you find somebody is really glamorous and you really try to find out, and you succeed in really finding out about them, probably you may still like them, but they won't be as glamorous anymore. You know, it will be like you elect the politician, and you may still like them, you may still vote for them, but they won't represent all your hopes and dreams. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, you know, there's a kind of celebrity who exists basically to feed the tabloids. And I mean, this goes back to the question about oversharing, whatever. There are certain people whose celebrity is based on the idea that you're constantly finding stuff out about them. And partly they may share that, you know, they may do it deliberately, or, you know, they may be, and these days they're often associated with reality shows, which are all based on the idea that, you know, you enter these, you know, basically you know these people. That's the appeal. And that's not a traditional form of glamour. I mean, I have this, I don't talk about this in the book, partly because I couldn't figure out exactly what I thought, which was that is there something glamorous about the idea of being on a reality show, so that the characters are not glamorous because you know too much about them, but maybe having that kind of acclaim and attention is sort of glamorous to people, or maybe it's just the lifestyle was glamorous. You know, it depends on which reality show you're on, I guess. You know, but the Kardashians, they're rich. You know, maybe not so much Honey Boo Boo. You know, that's a different thing. That's sort of a freak show. But yeah, yeah, okay, yeah,
I'm just to say, with regard to when you were in the review and the inquiry,
yeah,
I thought, when I read it, and what I thought was so, the point was that her tendency is to go right to be negative about how a woman responds to herself, and everything, that if a woman responds to an image of a beautiful woman, that she's feeling less than. And that was how she tended to do it. But when she saw that her brother had this image, and now he's successful, and I think he was a little odd, or
yeah.
just not as, maybe
He was kind of a classic Star Trek fan, yeah. Right. Yeah.
engaged him enough that he now has a real purposeful, wonderful life that he's developed out of his own
Right,
interests,
yeah.
and other people would have
Yeah.
thought, what's going to happen? So it made her think, maybe that first reaction I have about women's response to beauty needs to be rethought.
Right, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's why I thought
Thank
this
you
was
very much for that. That was a good, much better. And I think that's true, and I think I actually think, has nothing to do with my book specifically, but I'm actually disturbed by the number of women who are in their 30s and up whose professional lives depend on them being obsessed with their looks and feeling bad about their looks. I mean, you really, by the time you get out of college, you sort of outgrow that. And it shouldn't be, it also shouldn't, like, your now this particular woman, I can never get her exact name right, Autumn Madrano, she's got a hyphenated last name. She's really smart and really interesting and has a lot of really interesting insights about it, and she's actually writing a book on the subject. But I think it's got to be more complicated, because the response to beauty is not a new thing. It takes different forms in different eras, what people consider beautiful. You know, I mean, I spent a lot of time looking through lots and lots of old magazines, lots and lots, primarily, but not exclusively, fashion magazines, and particularly some of the looks in the late 50s and early 60s are very unappealing by today's standards, even if you know, if you abstract away, the face may be beautiful, the body may be beautiful, but the sort of kind of artifice, it's like looking at something from 18th century France or something. It's just, you know, it's like, really? They thought that looked good? But the desire for beauty is the desire to be exposed to beauty is very powerful, and the desire to be beautiful, particularly for women, but I don't think exclusively for women, is very powerful as well. And I don't think you escape that. I think you only kind of can sort of cordon off the negative aspects of it. Thank you.